John had a very rich and long career in primatology. He's as is mentioned on the poster. He studied almost, or if not all, of the great apes and lesser apes, and he's covered an amazing variety of different topics. Those of you who are just starting out in the field probably know him best for his work with chimpanzees in Kibale in the Ngogo site, but he's done a lot of impressive work with gibbon vocalization with orangutans as well as gorillas and the whole gambit. So besides just a great ape expert, he's a great ape guy, one of the very sociable, kind, empathetic primatologists that I know in the field, and it's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to welcome him to present some of his experiences to all of you listeners. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to John.
I'm sorry, I didn't have that up until now, but you can all see my screen now?
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction and giving me this opportunity to speak to you tonight. I'm especially pleased to have this opportunity since I have long-standing ties not only to Japan, but to Japan primatology as well. I find myself at the end of a very long career now. And as I look back on the past 40 or so years, the one thing that I keep on coming back to is how incredibly lucky I've been. I've been lucky because I've had a unique opportunity to study the 5 animals depicted on the screen. These, of course, are our closest living relatives, the apes. There have been many twists and turns along the way, but if there's one recurrent theme, it's that very little of about what I'm about to tell you was ever planned, because my story emphasizes the role that serendipity plays in science. My story begins as all stories do in youth. As I was growing up, I had no particular interest in animals or their study or their behavior, but everything changed one day when I was a senior in high school. This book arrived in the mail. My parents had purchased it for my younger brother. He's an architect now. I got to the book first. I stole it, and it remains on my bookshelf to this day. The book was called The Marvels of Animal Behavior and was published by the National Geographic Society. In keeping with the magazine, the book was just full of these wonderful pictures of exotic animals in equally exotic locales. I opened up the book and was immediately entranced. As an added bonus, the chapters were written by a veritable who's list in the study of animal behavior. Folks like Dick Alexander, Jack Bradbury, Steve Emlin, Gordon Orians, and my personal hero, George Schaller. The chapter that intrigued me the most, though, was the final one, a chapter written by Irv DeVore on baboons. I filed away what I could learn from the book, and I went to college, the University of California, Berkeley, where Sherry Washburn, one of the founding fathers of the modern study of primatology in America, was teaching at the time. I took a few classes and was immediately hooked. Now, I was incredibly fortunate to go to school during the 1970s because these were very heady times in the study of animal behavior. In 1973, Carl von Frisch, Konrad Lorenz, and Nico Tinbergen were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for their seminal studies in ethology. 2 years later, in 1975, Ed Wilson published Sociobiology. Now, it was in sociobiology that Wilson resurrected and renewed interest in Bill Hamilton's long-forgotten theory of kin selection. Now, when I heard about this idea for the very first time, I started to wonder whether it would be possible to use some newly developed techniques designed to assay genetic variation in natural populations and combine that with a behavioral study, a study of something like a baboon, to investigate whether who's related to whom actually affects who does what with whom. I took some of those ideas to graduate school, where I was very fortunate to work under the supervision of Peter Rodman. Peter had just completed one of the very first successful field studies of orangutans in the wild, and being trained at Harvard and by DeVore and Wilson, he was thoroughly enmeshed in this emerging field of sociobiology. My plans for graduate study were to evolve and change, and they were to change quite quickly. I remember sitting in class one day during my very first year, listening to Peter lecture about the conditions which would make it both easy and difficult for a group of primates to defend a territory. I took the ideas that Peter presented that day, and with his help and guidance, turned them into my first paper. It was in this paper that we proposed an index of defendability, a simple ratio of the average distance a group of primates traversed on any given day, divided by a measure of the size of their range. We reasoned that in situations when this index was large and exceeded 1, it would be fairly easy for a group of primates to move from one end of their territory to the other and defend it against others. In contrast, when that index was small and less than 1, the cost of defense would be prohibitive. Now, this was a pre-internet age, at a time when information wasn't instantly available at your fingertips. So what did I do? I did what you had to do back in the day. I actually went to the library, I dug into the literature, I tried to discover what I could learn about the ranging habits of primates as it was then documented. And when we put everything together, we found that observations generally conformed to prediction. Now, looking back on that paper, I think it's fair to say that the paper helped introduce cost-benefit thinking into the study of primate behavior, because it was one of the very first papers to explicitly acknowledge and recognize that there are costs as well as benefits to behavior. The paper also got me to start thinking about how one actually goes about doing comparative studies of primate behavior. And that was a theme to emerge in some of my later work, where I investigated variation in the number of males in primate groups, the role that male-male competition plays in the evolution of sexual dimorphism and size, and another study looking at the evolution of non-maternal caretaking in primates. As I continued in graduate school, my plans for a PhD thesis were changing, and they took a very sharp turn at the end of my first year. Peter came up to me one day and asked whether I wanted to accompany him to Borneo the next year. He had a grant to study the socioecology of primates at the time, and he needed students to man his field site. I, of course, said yes, and with that, I became a primate field worker, beginning with an utterly forgettable and failed attempt to study the behavior and locomotion of long-tailed macaques. Peter actually sent me back a second time, and that study or that time in the field was equally unsuccessful. So unsuccessful that I barely remember what happened. I came back during my third year of graduate school to regroup. And perhaps because of that paper we had just published on territoriality in primates, my thoughts turned to this issue. And I ended up developing a PhD project investigating territoriality in primates. I selected for study 2 animals that I had become familiar with in my travels in Borneo: socially monogamous gibbons and polygynous leaf monkeys. Those gibbons live in fairly small territories. They use them more or less exclusively. They overlap minimally with their neighbors. By contrast, leaf monkeys live in equally small territories, but ones that overlap quite extensively with their neighbors. Using some results from a fabulous study that had just been completed by Rich Danaza on the rare and endangered Klaus gibbons, as well as some theoretical ideas that had just been developed by Steve Emlin and Lou Oring I hypothesized that the gibbons were defending space, while leaf monkeys were engaging in a form of female mate defense. Now, as an undergraduate, I become quite fascinated and enamored of the work of Nico Tinbergen, who had pioneered the use of field experiments to examine functional questions about animal behavior. Because of that, I decided to implement a series of experimental playbacks using recorded calls to simulate encounters between gibbons and leaf monkeys at various parts of their territories. The technique had been implemented successfully for the very first time in a wild primate by Peter Wasser in a study of mangabeys in Uganda. Peter Wasser was to become a very important mentor to me. He lent me some very expensive playback equipment and was later to serve on my PhD committee. Now, in my playback work with the gibbons, I was able to show that both their vocal and their spatial responses waned as one moved out from the center of their territory to their boundary and into their neighbor's range. Results consistent with the hypothesis that gibbons were in fact defending space per se. While those were quite satisfying results, my work with the leaf monkeys wasn't progressing nearly as well. In fact, I was failing and failing quite dismally. My problem was that I couldn't habituate the animals to my presence. They were shy, they were secretive, they lived at fairly low densities. And whenever we went out to look for them, I'd rarely find them. On those few occasions that I did, I would only gain fleeting glimpses of them as they ran away quite quickly in the treetops. Intriguingly, though, whenever I went out to look for the leaf monkeys and failed to find them, I would often run into something else, orangutans. And when I would run into one orangutan, I would run into more than one orangutan. They would often be together. Now, I knew from reading the literature, as well as Peter Rodman's own studies of these very same animals at this very same site, that this wasn't supposed to be happening. These were supposed to be solitary creatures. After about 9 months of banging my head against the wall, trying to habituate the leaf monkeys to my presence, I realized that it would be far more interesting, if not profitable, to switch my attention to the orangutans to figure out what they were doing. When I did so, I made a renewed commitment to fieldwork. I doubled down. I spent as much time as I possibly could with the orangutans. And when I did so, I was able to document the alternative mating tactics employed by male orangutans. Now, casual inspection of these animals will instantly reveal that there were two types or morphs of male orangutans. There are those that are large, as depicted on the left, individuals who possess secondary sexual characteristics, such as the feety cheek flanges on that colored male. Alternatively, there are smaller males that are about half the size as the large individuals. Now, during these early days of studies, it was quite natural to assume that this difference in size simply represented a difference in development. The large individuals were adults, and the small individuals had not yet matured. They were subadults. We now know, of course, that some of those small guys never grow up. Irrespective of whether the small male orangutans were old or young, they were always at a competitive disadvantage due to their small size. And in order to compensate and to reduce the levels of competition that they face from the larger males, the small males adopt a distinctly different alternative mating tactic, one in which they first find a female, they stay with them for as long as possible, and here's where things get a bit nasty. They forcibly and repeatedly mate females. The pattern shown by those small males differs quite dramatically from the pattern shown by the larger males. The theme of male sexual coercion was to appear later in my life when I began teaching at the University of Michigan. There, the very first class that I taught was a team-taught seminar on the topic with my friend and colleague, Barb Smuts. Barb later used some of the things that we learned from that class to write a very important review on this topic of male aggression and sexual coercion of females in primates and other mammals. My playback work with the gibbons was proceeding along, and it was going along quite nicely, so much so that I decided to implement the playback technique to investigate the long calls emitted by male orangutans. These are some of the most distinctive sounds heard in the Bornean rainforest. And here my playback results indicated that males seem to use this as a spacing mechanism, where low-ranking males generally avoided the calls emitted by the highest-ranking male in the area. I could find no evidence that males use these calls to attract females to them. Now, one's research interests often change as unexpected findings occur. And given my work on orangutan mating behavior, my thoughts soon turned to the puzzle created by gibbon monogamy. Now, monogamy in mammals is both theoretically rare and theoretically unexpected and empirically rare, found in only about 10% of all mammalian species. And the problem has always been, why do males accept these relationships? Here again, I decided to implement the playback technique to investigate this issue by simulating encounters between solitary females and mated pairs. When I did so, I discovered that mated females essentially impose these relationships on males by displaying sex-specific aggression toward other females. With the passage of time, that finding takes on renewed significance insofar as it bears on a current controversy over the factors that affect the evolution of social monogamy in mammals. The old gibbon result fits quite nicely with Dieter Lucas and Tim Cluttenbrock's hypothesis that social monogamy evolves in situations where single males can't defend multiple females. This because of high levels of female competition, female intolerance, creating low female densities. Now, throughout my graduate career, I was using the vocal signals produced by primates as a tool to simulate interactions between them and ask them questions about why are they doing the kinds of things that they were doing. In the process, it was impossible not to become interested in the sounds themselves. It was for this reason that during postdoctoral research, I decided to conduct studies of animal vocal communication. Here I was incredibly lucky to do that work working in the lab of Peter Marler. Peter was one of the true giants in the study of animal behavior. He was a recognized leader in the study of animal vocal behavior. And coincidentally, he happened to be the one who put together that book that originally caught my interest and attracted me to the field. During postdoctoral research, I spent most of my time trying to unravel the songs sung by male gibbons, first showing how male gibbons use these as a species discrimination mechanism. Most of my time, however, in the Marler lab, I was seeking answers to two questions: how male song is structured acoustically, and why were males singing? What is the function of song? With regard to the first issue, male gibbons engage in prolonged singing performances during the pre-dawn hours. Those singing performances last about 40 minutes in length, and male gibbons typically start those performances by emitting a series of fairly low amplitude, short songs that consist nothing more than these frequency upsweeps. As those singing performances continue, those songs get louder, they get longer, and they get more complex in terms of their constituent notes. With regard to the issue of song function, my observations showed that males frequently countersing with their neighbors, an observation consistent with the territorial spacing function. Additional observations indicated that song complexity increases during vocal interactions with neighbors, with males singing faster, louder, and longer, and with more elaborate songs than when singing alone. I conducted a series of experimental playbacks to further probe the function of song, and when I did so, I discovered that males responded more strongly to elaborate songs sung fast and loud compared to simple songs sung slower and at relatively low amplitude. Taken together, those results suggested that increasing song complexity represents a series of graded signals with long, complex songs, more effective territorial stimuli than short, simple songs. I concluded my time in the Marler lab with an investigation of the phonology of song. I began that study by decomposing the songs sung by gibbons into their constituent note types. I then created a mind-numbing series of analyses that, if I think back now, still hurt today, where I tried to determine whether there were specific rules that gibbons use in stringing those note types together to construct their songs. Once I was able to do so, I violated those rules, constructing artificial rearranged songs as depicted on the right. I played those songs back to the gibbons, compared the responses to responses that I got when I played back normal songs. They responded differentially, suggesting that there was, in fact, an underlying phonology to gibbon singing behavior. Gibbons appear to string those songs together in the very same manner or in a similar manner that we do when we string together meaningless phonemes into meaningful words. I conducted my postdoctoral research on gibbons at the newly established Cabang Panti Research Station in Gunung Palung National Park in Indonesia. I found this place in the summer of 1984 with Rhys Bowen and Mark Layton. And while I was there, I also attempted to start a parallel study of orangutans. That work has been continued to this day quite ably and quite nicely by Cheryl Knott and colleagues. But my work with gibbons and orangutans at Gunung Palung was cut short. And it was cut short because I was going to take a sharp turn in my research. Toward the end of my time in the Marlowe lab, I was feeling as if I needed a new challenge. Peter Marler was to issue that challenge by nudging me to the study of chimpanzees. As things turn out, he spent some time early in his career studying chimpanzees at Gombe with Jane Goodall. Once I took up that challenge, Toshisada Nishida was there to facilitate my change and my switch to chimpanzees. I had met Toshi earlier on a trip to Japan and at a conference in America. And when I was starting to contemplate this move to chimps, I wrote to him and I asked him whether it would be possible to study the chimpanzees at the Mali Mountains, where he'd been working for many years. Toshi agreed, and I morphed into a chimpanzee field researcher. For my first study, I investigated an enduring problem in the study of primate and animal vocal communication, whether learning affects the vocal acquisition process. Here, I focused on the long-distance pant hoots emitted by male chimpanzees, and I asked whether there was dialectal variation. This was an indirect way to get at the question of vocal learning insofar as local dialects are one correlate of the vocal learning process as we understand it in humans and male songbirds. We compared the calls produced by males at the two well-known study sites of Gombe and Mahali. These sites, of course, are located within close geographic proximity to each other along the along the eastern lake shore of Lake Tanganyika. And in our acoustic analyses, we were able to document some subtle differences in the buildup and climax phase of calls, with males at Mahali emitting buildups at faster rates and climax elements at higher frequencies than calls uttered by the Gombe males. Results consistent with the hypothesis that there are dialects. Now, in this paper, we follow a lead first proposed by Bill McGrew and Caroline Tootin. We try to be careful to consider and eliminate other factors that may have accounted for some of the acoustic differences that we had encountered or that we had uncovered. This came to be known as the method of exclusion, a method that was to be adopted in subsequent studies of chimpanzee cultural variation. My first foray into the lives of chimpanzees was a real eye-opening experience. Up until that time, I had only been working with socially monogamous gibbons and for the most part, solitary orangutans, where the demographic situation obviously affected and constrained the form, the frequency, and the patterns of social interactions that could take place. But here, for the very first time, I was actually working with truly social primates. It became instantly clear that social factors affected virtually all aspects of chimpanzee life and behavior. I was quick to recognize that dominance rank relationships affected call production. This in a paper with Nishida. I may have been especially sensitized or sensitive to the fact that social factors would affect vocal behavior, because while I was a postdoc in the Martyr Lab, I had a good friend and colleague, Marcel Guiguier, who was conducting an influential study on the alarm calling behavior of male chickens. Working together with Steve Karakashian and Peter Marler, Marcel documented the so-called audience effect in chickens, whereby male chickens modulated the production of their alarm calls in the presence and absence of different conspecifics. Remembering that study, I asked whether something similar might be going on in chimps. And here, again, working along with Nishida, we're able to show that there was an audience effect in chimps. Male chimpanzees actually modulate the production of their alarm calls, increasing the number of calls they give in certain social situations, specifically when their close friends and allies are in the party that day. They seem to use these calls as a means to keep in contact with others, but not with everybody, only specific individuals, only the kinds of individuals or the particular individuals that they like and associate with frequently. I was later to merge these two seemingly disparate lines of research, vocal plasticity, as suggested by the dialect study, and the effect of social factors on vocal production in this paper. For years, I was conducting acoustic analyses of chimpanzees' calls, often focusing on the long-distance panhoot. And in those papers and analyses, we typically only examine single calls emitted by solitary individuals. I knew, however, that males often call together in choruses with others. For the most part, we set those calls aside because spectrographically they're quite messy. You had males calling on top of each other. It was difficult to figure out who's who in those spectrograms. But one day in my lab, I made a fortuitous observation. In examining some spectrograms of chorus calls, I started to notice that the climax portion of those calls during choruses looked awfully similar to each other. Armed with that observation, I then tasked Julie Gross-Lewis the arduous job of analyzing those chorus calls. And when she did so, she discovered that male chimpanzees produced acoustically similar calls when chorusing together, but they didn't do so all the time. Again, they selectively did so when calling with their friends, not with others. The process seems to be similar to the process of vocal accommodation as we understand it in humans. And I think this is something that most people can understand and identify and agree and understand. Vocal accommodation is this process whereby you start to adopt the different speech mannerisms, customs, habit, even words of different people when you move to a different area. It's seen as a way to fit in. I'd recruited Dick Byrne to the dialect study, as Dick had been to Mohali before and made some recordings. Well, in Scotland, to obtain those recordings, I ran into Bill McGrew. I have this vague recollection of weaving down the streets of St. Andrews late one night with Bill, turning to him and asking him whether the time was right for another meeting of great ape researchers. This to recreate a meeting that had been held in Austria nearly 20 years before. That suggestion led to the publication of this book. This book, in turn, the result of this meeting of great ape researchers in Mexico. And here's where my life takes another serendipitous turn. David Watts happened to be at that meeting. Up until that time, David had been studying the behavior of mountain gorillas at the Karasoke Research Center along with Diane Fossey and others. David, however, was beginning to wonder whether he wanted to start studying something else, something like chimps. And in fact, the very next summer, he was planning to go to this place called Ngogo in Kibale National Park to conduct a pilot study. When I learned of David's plans, I immediately asked him if I could tag along. And I had several reasons for doing so. First reason was that I had no plans to return to Mohali the following year, and I was looking for something to do. Secondly, this was Kibale. It was a legendary field site. It was a place that I always wanted to see. It had been established over 20 years ago by Tom Strusaker, who I knew, as Tom was one of Peter Mahler's first graduate students. So I already felt as if I was part of the Kibale family. I went the next summer, and as an added bonus, Tom showed up. I spent some of the best days I've ever spent in the field with Tom, walking the Ngogo forest day in, day out, trying to learn everything I could from him about Ngogo, Kibale, and Uganda. Before Tom showed up, I had already realized that Ngogo was a very special place because there were chimps and they were everywhere. This was because the community of chimps at Ngogo is by far the largest that has been described anywhere on the African continent. Now, this was only supposed to be a visit. It was really a vacation. I had every intention of returning to Mohali the very next year to resume my studies of the Mohali chimps with Nishida, who had developed a very close friendship and collaboration. But with each and every passing day during that first summer at Ngogo, the lure being created by the Ngogo chimps was just too much to resist. At the end of the summer, I sat down with David. I asked him whether or what he thought about starting a joint collaboration and collaborative study of the Ngogo chimps. He agreed, and the rest is history. It's been a tremendously satisfying and productive collaboration. I began my studies on the Ngogo chimpanzees where I had left off at Mohali, with studies of their vocal behavior. But right from the start, I knew that this might be the place where I could fulfill that original dream I had in graduate school, where I could do a study of kin selection and primate behavior. So right from the very beginning, I set out to try to obtain genetic data from the Ngogo chimpanzees. After several failed attempts, we were finally able to coax mitochondrial DNA out of some hair samples. And that led to the publication of a few papers. The results in these papers, however, were far from satisfying. They were far from satisfying because at the end of the day, they were only based on a single gene, mitochondrial DNA. And that gave us only an imprecise understanding of who was actually related to whom. I was only able to fill that dream I had in graduate school after I was able to recruit a brilliant young graduate student in the form of Kevin Klangergraber. For his PhD thesis, Kevin conducted and completed this heroic study where he typed an astronomical, astounding number of genetic loci from a large sample of chimpanzees. Those genetic data gave us a fairly good understanding of who is actually related to whom. We combined Kevin's data with my behavioral observations and were able to show that kinship mattered. Males who were related to each other at the level of maternal half-sibs cooperate and affiliate in each of these 6 different behavioral contexts far more frequently than do unrelated individuals. I was able to extend that result by showing that those same maternal half-sibs form long-lasting and enduring social bonds. More recently, one of my final graduate students, Aaron Sandell, has shown that those bonds that are developed that are formed or established and maintained in adulthood actually begin in adolescence, when males become independent from their mothers for the first time. And in some other work, my final graduate student, Rachna Reddy, now at Harvard studying bonobos, has been able to show, as others have in the past, that sibling bonds persist following maternal loss, as older siblings adopt and start to care for their younger siblings following maternal death. Our studies on the Ngoko chimpanzees have provided insights into other aspects of their behavior, including their hunting. As is the case at other sites, chimpanzees at Ngoko hunt vertebrate prey. And like at other sites, their favorite prey are red colobus monkeys. The unusual thing about hunting at Ngoko, however, is that chimpanzees hunt red colobus monkeys with very high success and proficiency. Those hunting success rates are so high that it has led to a precipitous drop in the red colobus prey population over a 20 or so year period. There's been an 80 to 90% drop in the number of red colobus at Ngoko due to chimp hunting. And as the chimps have decimated the population of red colobus at Ngoko, they've started to hunt other animals that they barely touched 20 years ago. We used some of our early observations at hunts to address an important theoretical problem about why male chimpanzees share meat and do so readily with others. Here we are able to validate an old hypothesis originally proposed by Nishida, who suggested that male chimpanzees use meat as a political tool to develop and maintain social relationships and bonds with others. Our studies on the Ngoko chimpanzees might be best known for the insights that have been made into the question of topic of chimpanzee territoriality. And this brings me full circle back to that very first paper I published on primate territoriality. As is the case with many animals, chimps are territorial. Interactions between members of different groups are typically hostile. Boundary patrol behavior is an integral part of chimpanzee territoriality. And what happens here is quite interesting. These patrols involve instances where groups of chimps will gather together and move in quite directed fashion to the boundary of their territory, oftentimes entering the territory of their neighbors. On some very rare occasions, male chimpanzees or chimpanzees, patrollers will encounter their neighbors and launch lethal coalitionary attacks on them. For years, our understanding of why chimps kill their neighbors proved elusive. But after about 15 years of a study, we're able to provide an answer, validating a hypothesis first proposed by Richard Wrangham, who suggested that chimpanzees kill their neighbors in an effort to seek dominance over them. Over the course of about 10 years, the Ngogo chimpanzees killed several members in a community living to the northeast of their territory. And after having done so, and reducing the coalitionary strength of their neighbors to such an extent, the Ngogo chimpanzees were simply able to move in to that new territory, usurp a large portion of a territory previously occupied by their neighbors. We started to use the long-term data we've collected on the Ngogo chimpanzees to address some long-standing issues about what makes us human. Here, we oftentimes think of ourselves as being a bit unusual insofar as we display a slow life history. We grow up very slowly. We start reproducing relatively late in life. And some of us, if we're lucky, we live a very long time. Our studies on the Ngogo chimpanzees now, however, show that chimpanzees there survive at very high rates across the entire lifetime, at much higher rates than do chimpanzees elsewhere. In fact, the pattern of survivorship by the chimpanzees at Ngogo resembles the pattern shown by humans living in some natural fertility populations much more closely than that does survivorship in other chimpanzee groups. So here we've been able to reduce the gap between them and us in one important respect. High survivorship among the Ngogo chimpanzees leads to a situation where chimps there live a lot longer than chimps elsewhere. And this has paved the way for some collaborative work that we've been recently doing with Melissa Emery Thompson, Tony Goldberg, and others investigating the aging process. Here, we've been able to show that fecal parasite loads increase as females age. We have some suggestive evidence from 2 independent studies that the viral loads of male chimpanzees increase as they age. And other work shows that the gut microbes of chimpanzees change as they age, with young infant chimpanzees showing high gut microbial diversity, a pattern that's directly opposite from the pattern shown by humans. We have yet to publish our most surprising finding about the aging process in the Ngogo chimpanzees. For now, we have solid demographic and hormonal data that indicate some female chimps at Ngogo experience menopause. Here we've known for a very long time that many female chimps at Ngogo survive into their 40s, with some living well beyond the time they give birth for the final time. If we compute Levitas and Lackey's post-reproductive representation statistic, we find that to be about 0.2. What this means is that a female chimpanzee at Ngogo actually survives to adulthood. She's expected to spend about 1/5 or about 20% of her entire life in a post-reproductive state. Now, while these data are interesting, I doubt that they're going to convince anybody that these females are truly menopausal. But we have corroborating hormonal data for those same post-reproductive females, show high levels of gonadotropins and corresponding low levels of ovarian hormones. And if anybody doubts the age of some of these chimpanzees that we have at Ngogo, we now have converging lines of evidence suggesting that these are really, really, really old chimps. For the past few years, we've been able, mostly through sheer luck, able to recover the carcasses of some chimps who died. And some of those older chimps are showing clear signs of not only osteoarthritis, but importantly, osteoporosis. The defining feature of the Ngogo chimpanzees has always been its size. The community was large. It's always been large. It was large at the start. But during the past decade, the community has gotten even bigger. That growth has been fueled in part by a secular increase in the fruit supply, but with growth comes dissolution. About 3 years ago, the community finally fissioned with total spatial and social segregation between members of these two groups. The split was a process. It played out over the course of about 3 years, where there's a gradual social and spatial separation between members living in these two groups. It's quite interesting to watch, if not unbelievable to see, that some of these individuals, especially these males who've lived their lives together, grew up together, were friends, all of a sudden turn on each other and start behaving aggressively. For during that 3-year period, not only did they start to separate spatially and socially, but they also started to have encounters that were quite aggressive. We marked the split by a particular event, after which there is no further interchange, social interchange between members of these two groups. And that occurred when members of the smaller group killed a young male from the larger group. As if to place a stamp on matters, the very next year, members of the smaller group turned around and killed another older adult male depicted here in that larger group. Lest you think that things have settled down and everything's fine, the saga continues. And that smaller group is still on a rampage. Just within the past year, members of that smaller community have killed 4 chimpanzees living in the larger community, one of whom was an infant born to this female last September. Now, what, if anything, have I learned from all this? And is there anything that I might be able to pass on to some of the younger members in the audience today? I began this discussion by noting how serendipity has played a large role in my life. It'd be great to sit here and be able to tell you that everything that I just discussed in the past few minutes was planned and was planned meticulously right from the start, and that everything worked out. You'll now know, of course, that that would just be a lie. We're taught as scientists to use current theory, develop hypotheses based on that theory, and then go out and test those hypotheses by conducting experiments or collecting observations. But more often than not, I think you're going to find that things aren't going to work out. No matter how good the plan is, how meticulous the study was at the beginning. It's because of this that I've always told my students and anybody else who comes out in Ngogo that the first rule of a good field worker is that you have to be opportunistic. You have to be flexible because things aren't always going to work out. I urge people to be flexible and simply just keep your eyes open, follow the leads that your animals provide. Second, some might view my career as a bit odd. I started out as an experimentalist and I morphed into a simple observer of the natural world. That was a choice, and a choice that I made quite happily because there's nothing that gives me greater pleasure these days than going out and just spending long periods of time watching the chimps, sitting back and letting them tell me their stories. The payoffs are far and few between because these are long-lived animals who give up the secrets of their lives to us as human observers only very slowly. But when a discovery is made, there's can be nothing more satisfying. So maybe a second piece of advice I'd give to you would to be patient, like me, and maybe do something that I think far too many in this field are getting away from. Go to the field, spend time with your animals, watch them closely. If you do, I can guarantee you that your animals will inform as well as surprise and delight. I also started off by indicating how lucky I've been. I'm quite fond of saying something that's absolutely true. I've been to places and seen and done things that most people can only dream about. Along the way, I've had the great and good fortune to have some wonderful mentors and great and good friends and colleagues with whom to work. And along the way, I've been quite generously supported by many private and public funding agencies. I realize that everybody's different. Mentors, colleagues are not always the same, but if you find good ones, I suggest you lean on them, because this is a lot more fun doing together with others than it is alone. Finally, while I've been lucky, I'd argue that you're lucky too. You're lucky because you belong to this small collective of primatologists who have been given these wonderful opportunities to study an amazing group of animals, our closest living relatives, the non-human primates. I've conducted research on the cooperative behavior of male chimpanzees for over 20 years now. And something that's obvious was quite clear right from the start. The collective is much stronger if we all work together than if we work alone and as individuals. Given that, I'd urge you to do your research. I know you're going to do it well, but as you do so, use every opportunity to do something to pay back, contribute to the collective, not only to ensure that primates will be conserved for future generations, but also to ensure that others will be given the same wonderful opportunities that we've been given to work with these amazing animals. With that, I'll conclude. But before I do, I want to thank each and every one of you tonight for giving me this opportunity to speak to you and indulging this old man as I've taken the stroll down memory lane. Thanks.
Thanks, John. That was beautiful. Really nice.
Thanks so much. Absolutely. That was a real pleasure to be a part of. Yeah, and so just before I open this up to questions from our audience, panelists and attendees, I just wanted to make a personal note. I really like how you were able to thread in this presentation and all the stories you talked about, but also through the people that were influential to you. And I think that focus on like people in primatology, that's something I also get a lot of exposure to through Mike here, who was also my mentor. And I've tried to take as much as I can from that still today as a mentor and somebody I rely on quite regularly. But what also popped out to me in this presentation was how kind of foundational and textbook a lot of your work is. And that's something, you know, growing up as a student of primatology, your name is always popping up in textbooks and for a lot of that work. But it's nice to kind of hear that it's also part of kind of serendipitous and exploratory process. So I think that's also a nice thing to add for anybody up and coming as well, that you don't necessarily have to set out to redefine a textbook or change the way people think. But a lot of times, if you put in the time and pay attention, it can happen. So thank you so much. It was a pleasure hearing all that in person.
That's very kind of you, but you know, you will understand what I'm about to say. I just view my life and my career as one accident after another, sort of being at the right place at the right time and having this wonderful support of so many people around me, you know, just got lucky.
It's good when it happens that way. We've got to, like you said, pay forward and let that help that happen more often.
Yeah, I'm sorry I said all that without my video on, but anyways, here I am. So I'd like to open it up for any of our guests. I've mentioned in the chat that for the attendees, it would be great if you could put any questions you have in the Q&A. And for any of the panelists, you can also use the Q&A or just raise your hand and we'll get to you in sequence here. And then later on, if there's anything in Zoom, we can, in YouTube, we can bring that as well. Usually it takes a moment for our audience to warm up here, digest everything they've just heard. But to fill that gap, maybe I actually had a question, a couple of questions, but maybe I'll start with one. We recently had a grad student who's also interested in this topic of post-reproductive parts of the life cycle. And since you brought it up with the chimpanzees, I'm kind of curious on your take, John, about the potential evolutionary explanations for that. I know that you didn't really get into it, and maybe there was a reason for that, but so finding the evidence, and it looks quite strong for post-reproductive life in chimpanzee females is one thing, but then what is your take on the mechanism or the evolutionary potential for that?
Well, that's a great question. Question that's obviously going to arise. I think I could say one thing, that if these female chimps are in fact menopausal, it's not due to grandmothering, because you know that female chimpanzees move between groups and they often aren't living with their maternal grandkids who they could clearly recognize and contribute to. As we constructed this paper, which is now in review, the one possible alternative would be, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Michael Kant and Rufus Johnston's reproductive conflict model, which they've applied to not only humans, but some of these killer whales who have also been described as menopausal. So the idea there is that in situations where female relatedness will increase with age, you might get something like this, especially in situations where females are competing for a limited set of resources and one's female reproduction comes at a cost to another. So you pit, these females together in this reproductive conflict. Older females who generally are related to others much more than a new female who's come in and knows nobody and has no relatives. Older females should lose that conflict because they're going to impose costs on other relatives by continuing to reproduce, so they just might give up. That's the one, potential thing that we can think of as a result of this. The other question that's obviously, I think, going to arise from this is why hasn't this been shown before? Because people have been studying chimps for years. And here, the point that I was trying to emphasize is that our chimps just live a long time, much longer than anybody else. There have been other skeletal studies of chimps, and that osteoporosis and poor old Marlena, my colleagues who are bone biologists, skeletal biologists, have said they've never seen anything like this in their lives, in a human. How Marlena got along, with a body like that is pretty amazing.
I mean, around 70 is incredible.
Yeah.
Well, I want to say something else. Some have doubted the age estimates we've made for our chimps, but here, one of the dirty little secrets of chimp studies is that, everybody's making stuff up at the start. You appear.
Yeah, the theories, yeah.
Theories, yeah.
Nishida shows up in 65 at Mahali. He doesn't know anybody who's related to whom, how old they are. I don't want to say I was prescient, but that we have deep pedigrees because we started that genetic work so early, and we know who was related to whom. So we were able to do it, and coming up with our age estimates, we were able to do something that most people aren't able to do. We were to construct these, genealogies and string things together. So Marlena's could be an example. You say 70, that's nuts, that's crazy. But she was pretty damn old when we got there. She looked like an old lady. And through the genetic work, we are able to show that she had a very old adult male, an adult male who himself had an older son. So, by constructing these things, making certain assumptions about when females start to give birth and her birth intervals and so on and so forth, I think we were able to put things together in a way that most people weren't able to do.
Yeah.
So I'll stand by our age estimates.
Very cool. Very cool. We have a question in the chat from Nelson. There's a weird echo going on here that I don't know where it's coming from. Nelson, do you want me to read it out, or do you want to pop on the mic there and ask yourself?
I can actually see it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the question is, in the context of your research interests in primatology over several decades, where do you hope some of the main topics presented today go in the future? And thanks for your valuable time, from Nelson.
Well, I think there I would have to shift gears. I've been lucky in doing the kinds of things that I've done and indulging my own personal interests. But right now, I think prime focus has to be on conserving primates, because without that, there's nothing to study anymore. I was in a meeting where this issue came up, and whether there's going to be a need for funding primatology in the future. And, you could sit here maybe and think, well, of course there will be. And there are going to be lines for primatologists like us and jobs in the future. They're not going to be, given the way the world seems to be going, and, primates being lost left and right. Mm-hmm. So I think if I were to start now, I may have taken an entirely different course.
Just to follow up on that, I think there was a symposium at the IPS that just happened a couple of weeks ago that was on primate conservation and posing the question of whether we should continue basic research for primate conservation or transition much more into activism. I just wondered if you had any take on that as well, in terms of how we actually conduct the studies that get us towards conservation. Maybe that's the context there.
I think we need basic research, and there are just so many unanswered questions, and that we're sometimes just flying blind and trying to manage, populations of primates. Here's a great example for you. I work in Kibale National Park, and I've done so for nearly 30 years now. Tom Schusager got started there 50 years ago. And since Tom's inception of his study, there have been hundreds of people roaming all around this small little park. Only until recently did we have any idea that we just have so many chimpanzees there. And we know this now because Kevin Langergraber has been doing some capture-recapture genetic work. We also fund these anti-poaching patrols that go out, teams of people who go out and pick up snares that have been set illegally, largely to capture small game, things like tiger, but chimpanzees will sometimes get caught in. While they've been doing that, they've just been picking up feces, chimpanzee feces, that they find. Kevin is able to type those feces, identify individuals, and through that work, he's discovered that there are tons of chimpanzees in Kibale, far more than anybody could have ever imagined. So yeah, there's a need for basic research, because we just don't know where to start unless you have basic information like this about numbers. Can I go back? I'm getting old, and on my attention span. That you asked about where, Nelson asked about where should the field go. Hand in hand with trying to conserve primates, I'm a big advocate for long-term studies. Many of the things I talked about today. would never have been revealed unless we were on the ground studying the Ngogo chimpanzees for years at a time. And I think an argument can be made that some of our most surprising findings about the lives of these animals have only been revealed when people are on the ground for not a year or two, but many, many years. So I hope that we continue as best as we can.
Okay, thanks very much. We have a question from Zihong, who's got his hand up here. Go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, thank you very much for your amazing talk. It's really interesting. And then my question would be, it's really amazing to hear that how you've been working with these different peoples and how they're supporting your research. And I would like to ask, younger students, is there some experience you can share with us about how to meet these people, and more importantly, how to learn from these people and maintain a relationship with them?
Well, one, on the meeting of people, you live in a different age. It took me, I actually had to go to Japan to meet Nishida. But we live in a very different world now. You can email, you could, connect socially with them. And I realize that not all of my colleagues are responsive, but, I'd say persistence also pays off. I would never be shy if you have an opportunity to go to a professional meeting or participate in something like this on Zoom, a remote talk. Never be shy of, popping in and asking a question, showing your face, introducing yourself. That's one way, obviously, to meet people that wasn't available to me back in the day when I had to go to the library. I'm sorry, I forgot. And you said how to develop and maintain these. Well, it's often done just at a personal level, it seems to me. You must be a student at PRI.
Yeah.
Well, there you have great folks like Mike, like Takesh, who may or may not be here. You have great mentors and researchers there that I'm sure you're seeing, meeting daily, working with, discussing matters with. That's where things develop. I got quite lucky again, now that I recall things. Things were done differently back in my day. When I was searching to do a postdoc, my advisor, Peter Rodman, just got on the phone, called Peter Marler. Peter Marler called me the very next day, which was crazy. And invited me to come out, give a talk, look me over. I guess I made a good impression. But, I do recognize that not everybody meshes, that everybody's different. I just think, do your work, try to be helpful. You'll go far.
Yeah, that will work. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have a question, actually a comment here in the Q&A. It's from Michio Nakamura, who says, not a question, but I just want to say hello to John. I was staying in Mahale as one of the TV crew when you were recording Chimps Pant Hoots there. And he said, I guess my camera person's disturbed you sometimes, so sorry for that.
Long forgotten, Michio. Don't worry about it. No, Michio was a student at Mahale when I was there doing my work. Good times. And see, we still get along. I would never have remembered that unless he just mentioned it.
The beauty of our collective memories, right? Yeah.
Only remember the good stuff for the most part.
We have a question. Sorry, John.
There were good times. good times at Mahali. Yeah, I spent a lot of good times with Michio and Nishida and many others.
So we have a question from Kristen Haverkamp in the chat here, who's asking, as you summarized and described in various papers, the individuals in the Ngogo community experience, sorry, the chat just moved on me there, experience particularly high longevity rates over their lifetime compared to other chimps populations. And you said a big part is the increasing fruit abundance, but are there other important factors apart from possible low hunting rates or poaching in Kibale?
Well, that's one factor that we've always attributed the longevity and the high survival rates, this incredible fruit supply at Ngogo. Here's one measure of that most people don't know about and isn't widely advertised. Most of you have worked in different parts of the African and Asian tropics to study primates, where there are two types of monkeys, colobines and cercopithecines. Wherever you go, there's generally far more colobines than there are cercopithecines, right? And that's because of the differences in the food supply. There are leaves and there are leaves everywhere. And everywhere I've ever been, there's always, if there are colobines and cercopithecines, there are far more leaf eaters and fruit-eating cercopithecines. Ngogo is different. Even before the chimps decimated the red colobus population, there were far more mangabes, red-tails, baboons than there were black and white colobus and red colobus. So that there too, I think, shows you something about the food there. There's always, one of the other things that convinced me to go to start in Ngogo was the chimps are in these giant parties all the time. They're easy to find and follow. And that's because there's a ton of food. So yeah, it's just a different place. And it's different from some place as close as Kaniwara, which is only 10 kilometers away as a crow flies, where Richard Wrangham and colleagues have been working on chimps. So Kibale is on a hill and Kaniwara is a lot higher than us. So we have different trees that just that chimps depend on that just aren't there at Kaniwara. And we have the same trees which will fruit and don't fruit at all there. So go figure. A second factor that I think has played a big role in affecting the longevity of the chimps at Ngogo is disease transmission and actually anthropogenic disease transmission. So if you look at these studies at everywhere else, chimp populations have been hit. They've been hit hard by human disease transmission. And until 2017, we were free and clear. We had no obvious events of us transmitting anything to the chimpanzees and cutting their lives short. We did have one big event in 2017, unfortunately, though. And these analyses that we've been doing are generally cut off there and trying to account for that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So two big factors, two really big factors.
Okay, thanks. Can I pull over to our YouTube correspondent, Nahoko? Do you want to read that question that we had from there?
Okay, sure. There is a question from Dr. Suzuki Shigeru. And the question is, he is wondering about the cultural difference in primatology between Western and Japanese in terms of themes, and methodology, and anthropomorphism, and so on. And how do you think about this?
You know what? One thing maybe I didn't mention that really played an important role in sort of giving up my experimental way of life is when I started to work with Nishida at Mahali, and where I saw how he operated in a very different way than I did. I sort of was grew up in an ethological tradition where, there was an emphasis on the natural behavior of animals and watching them in the real world. But at the same time, I was doing all these experiments where I was messing up the lives of gibbons almost on a daily basis by doing those playbacks. But when I got to Mohali, I saw Nishida operating in a completely different way, just taking meticulous notes and detailed observation of just about everything you could ever imagine a chimpanzee doing. How many times one chimp scratched himself on his left side on a given day. So that had an influence on me and taught me, well, maybe it would pay off if I tried to pay a little more careful attention to what the animals are doing. And I think of that, what Nishida was doing, is very much, the Japanese way. Mike, you might correct me on this.
No, that was basically what Mitani and Kawamura and all the early people were starting out to do, and that's what they taught all of us to do that way. Yeah.
Well, it was a real eye-opener for me, and I learned just so much from him and by watching him. And I think that really influenced me to just settle down, spend some time with the animals, watch them closely.
Become the monkey.
I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I do think there is a very different, big difference there in the way Western science and Japanese primatology goes about studying primates. As I read this, themes, methodology, anthropomorphism, well, I think. So I'm not sure the way the question is being phrased. It is the implication that Japanese science is a bit more anthropomorphic than Western primatology?
I guess so.
Well, I don't know. I would contest that. There's as much anthropomorphism in Western primatology, I think.
And I think that's changed a lot as well in more recent times. Things have become more blended than they were when I started back in the late 70s, early 80s. That difference was still very, very present, but I think now it's much more integrated. There's less difference, I see.
Well, I think we've realized that and discovered so many things that these animals do that are so human-like, so it's impossible not to anthropomorphize. I defy anybody to spend an afternoon with chimps and not make human comparisons or think about humans when you're watching chimps. There's a difference too, Peter Marler, who was, again, a big influence on me, came from a very different world and tradition. He grew up in an era of the early ethologists, where they were trying to establish the study of animal behavior as a scientific discipline in Western science. So because of that, he was very reluctant, well, he did in his, well, he was very careful. So like animal personality or personality in the study of animals was taboo. You just didn't go there. But the field changed. When I was at Rockefeller working with Peter, the other person who was there was Don Griffin. Griffin, who discovered bat echolocation, and who most people forget or don't even know was responsible for the whole field of cognitive ethology and the idea. He was one of the first to argue quite strongly that animals had minds, they had feelings, they could think.
Yeah, I've got his book up here. That was, yeah.
He caught a tremendous amount of flack for that. Everybody thought Don was off his rocker and, going senile, but he had the stature and, he was comfortable in his own skin that he could say what he wanted to. But Don doesn't get enough credit for opening up that can of worms, that black back blocks. He was an amazing guy too.
Yeah, that's a really good point at the end there. I think the word I take out of that always is the anthropodenialism as a counterpoint to anthropomorphism, which I also use in my lectures as well. So it is interesting to see how those have kind of converged a little bit more in recent times, for sure, largely as part of that kind of cognitive revolution. And actually, I'm a little bit sensitive of the time, John, so I don't know if you have a hard limit on when you want to go. We don't have currently anything in the chat, but I did have one kind of question, which is because you brought up quite a lot in this presentation, Peter Marler and your studies on communication. And you mentioned this study of chickens that was interested in the audience effects and how that kind of influenced you in your study of chimpanzees. And I'm kind of curious about your take on the relationship between audience effects and kind of, maybe it's a mix of the two, but referential communication and intentionality. So there's other studies of chickens too that replicating the vervet studies that show that they do have some degree of referential communication about predators, aerial predators, but the accuracy is way lower than it would be for vervets or things like that. Oh. And I think some of the audience effects of chickens were about like in kind of mating feeding context, if I'm not wrong, where males might use a different type of communication based on whether there's a female around. But yeah, I'm just kind of wondering, a lot of the work in cognitive ecology and cognitive studies of animals is trying to see what extent these other animal species have versions of those more, let's say, higher capacity forms of communication. And I kind of wonder what your take is on all of that. And I mean, do chickens have the same kind of referential communication or some degree of intentionality related to those audience effects? Or are we looking at completely different things?
Boy, you're bringing me back to a time it was really long forgotten. I wrote a review that essentially this talk today. And when I was doing so, I had to reread some of my papers to remember I did. Okay, what did I do there? Yeah. But you're raising two distinctly different issues that were, big issue in the Marler lab when I was there. So that Guillermo, Marcel's paper actually established and coined the audience effect. And there they were trying to address the issue of whether animals were more than just simple automatons, emitting vocal signals in response to particular stimuli in the environment. That's what they were fighting back in the day, or what we were fighting back in the day. And the audience effect, what the audience effect really addresses is that, no, they seem to be able to, be flexible, and they have complete voluntary control over producing different sounds. And the experiment that was actually done was to predator models. So it was quite simple. Nico Tinbergen had actually done this. He had flown cutouts of aerial predators over animals, and they were small. So taking a leap from that, that's what Marcel did. He had these crude little cutouts of raptors in his little chicken coop research area. He flew them over and he placed the female mate or, a different female next to the male. And sometimes he would alarm, and sometimes he went, strangely, he gave more alarms when the new female was there instead of his mate. And when he was alone, he didn't call at all, which shows, no, if the predator's there and it's just a simple response, an automatic, response to the stimuli like a predator, he should call, but he doesn't. So that's what they were trying to get at in those days. And the referential signaling stuff comes up because later, Chris Evans comes to the lab and starts to do referential communication in chickens. And to be honest, Peter was trying to make a point too, that animal vocal behavior is a lot more similar to what we do in humans, not to be completely anthropomorphic, but we're not thinking of this maybe in the right way. that the difference is that there are rudiments of what we're doing in our own, communication, referential or semantic signaling. I always stayed out of that. I always stayed out of that because I didn't have a system, that seemed to apply. But I also stayed out of it because I always thought that, yeah, something might be there, but you might be pushing the envelope a little too far. I guess I could say that now that Peter's dead, but I'm not sure I would have said that 20 years ago to his face.
There's a lot we have to.
So, sorry.
There's a lot we have to benefit from hindsight. In one aspect, looking at how paradigms, how our ways of thinking have changed. Part of it may be due to animals responding to humans' stupid questions that we think at the time highly intelligent, but we're only getting from them what we're asking them, and they have so much more to tell us. Like you mentioned, just sitting there and watching and letting them teach you things, letting them give what's important to them to you, seems to have paid off in the long run. And that's why we have some of these bigger questions, because they're based more on reality of the animals than on what we perceive in our own minds, how we limit what we want to see or what we look for.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Yeah, I would, again, urge any of the younger people who may be still sticking around. I could easily say this because, I don't have the need to publish immediately, but I just think the payoffs are to be had by watching your animals.
I think that's a really nice way to end this International Primatology Lecture series, Past, Present, Future Perspectives of the Field, number 8 with Professor John Mitani. So thank you so much for joining, for giving us this presentation, and to the audience for joining and throwing up some good questions as well. Thanks, everyone.